You'll probably see, and I don't know if you have a bulletin or not, but if you did, you would have seen that the title for my sermon or reflection is, and this is a direct quote, "It's all in how you tell the story." And I'm going to just tell you that those aren't my words per se, so I'll just tell you where I got that from, and it's stayed with me ever since. Many years ago, a friend of mine who was working in healthcare and was going to people's homes in the capacity that they were working in. And they were with one client who had really had a tough life. And my friend, as she was listening to this, was almost overwhelmed with all of the trauma and hardship and difficulty that this particular client had been through. And she said to her, but the client was pretty positive and kind of was just sort of telling her this in a very matter-of-fact way. And so my friend, who was the healthcare worker, said, it's a lot of really tough stuff that you've had to deal with. And the client just looked at her and said, "It's all in how you tell the story." And I've always remembered that. It's all in how you tell the story. Because there's a lot of stories that we have that we need to tell, and then there are stories that we need to stop telling, right? If you've been to see a therapist at any time, they will say that you need to tell your story, you need to heal from your story, you need to, but then there comes a time when you need to stop telling certain stories. And in oral cultures, like first century Palestine, or in some of our First Nations people in this country, that was how wisdom and knowledge and information was passed from generation to generation, was through the stories that were told. The Hebrew tradition was also one of oral stories, and in fact the most important scripture in the Hebrew tradition, something called the Shema Yisrael, which is, you shall tell the story to your children and your children's children. And the story that they tell is the story of the Passover. So every year when they celebrate Passover and the Seder meal, the story is told of how the Hebrew people were in bondage in Egypt and how God brought them out of that bondage into freedom. So that's the tradition that Jesus came out of, was this tradition of oral stories. And we know that Jesus told many, many stories. And if you want to find sort of the sections of the Gospels where those stories are most prevalent, if you like healing stories, then head to Luke, because you see, Luke was a physician. And we always, when we tell a story, we're physically telling it, so it comes through our own lens, our own way that we see the world. And Luke was a physician, and so a lot of his stories focus around healing, because that would have been his life's work. He would be working in that area. Now, if you're interested in money, then go to Matthew, because Matthew was a tax collector. And so that was the stuff of his day-to-day life, was financial transactions. And so you'll notice a lot of the stories in Matthew will be around, somehow involve money or financial transactions. Mark is kind of the, I would say, the Cole's Notes of the whole New Testament, just the facts. This sticks to the facts, if you remember the old Cole's Notes from high school. So if you want to look at some of those stories, that's where they are. And I love the stories of Jesus. That's why we sang that first hymn. And there's nothing like a good story, because a good story engages the listeners, and people can find themselves in that story. And the thing about life is that most of life, in fact, probably very little of life, is black and white, right? Sometimes we wish it was either or, yes or no, black or white. But the truth about life is that it's mostly yes and. It's mostly shades of gray. And so stories enable us to see all of those different perspectives. And then we're able to solve a problem, but also, more importantly, we're able to see a situation through the eyes of other people. Well, as a minister over the years, I've often, let me backtrack a little bit. What brought me into the ministry was a central part of my call to ministry, and this is going back into ancient history, was I went through a period in my 20s where I was quite ill, and God brought me out of all of that. And I wanted to be able to share with other people the kind of freedom, the kind of liberation, wellness that I had experienced through the Gospels and sharing those stories. And so it's always been kind of a central part of who I am. And part of stories is making them accessible to the listeners. Jesus did that when he told the parables because he always used examples that were current from that time. And so you'll see him talking about shepherds or people that are farming, that are sowing seeds, etc. Now, I never met a shepherd until about maybe 15 years ago. So I really didn't know what shepherds did. I mean, we know, because we read, while they look after sheep. Well, if you haven't sort of been around sheep, you don't really have that understanding. I've never been a farmer. So while I can understand sowing seeds and some grow and some don't, it doesn't speak to me in this context. And as our world changes more and more, I think it's really important that we're able to tell those stories in ways that engage the listener. And over the years in the ministry, I've heard so many people, they will come to me and talk to me and begin to tell me about their life or about a situation. And I'm realizing this is a modern day gospel story. This is exactly what was happening in those stories. So let me give you an example. One of the things that I've done in the ministry is work with not just young people, but all ages, people that were in recovery, working at recovery from drug and alcohol addiction, and how faith is a part of that. So I was doing some of the faith today at Quinton Warner House some years ago. As you probably know, Quinton Warner House is one of the divisions of Mission Services of London. And often what happens in addiction is the disease, like any disease, takes over the person. It affects their behavior. And so when people come into recovery, and this was a residential program of about 5 months, they have a lot of things to sort out. They have a lot of healing to do. And one of the things is that often what will happen in addictions issues is that people will have acted in ways that were unhelpful and, hurt people over their time. And often that includes family. It pretty much always includes family. And so one of the things that would happen was that people would come in and start the program and start their healing. And then one of the first things was to make restitution with family members. So at the beginning of the group, I would always just sort of check in with people. It's a Tuesday morning, and check in with people and see how things have gone over the weekend, so forth. And so one day, and I have Jeff's permission this was Jeff's story, and I have his permission to tell you this story. In fact, he said, tell it to as many people as you can if you think it's going to be helpful. Jeff was a young man. He had not grown up in the church. He didn't profess any particular faith at the time. But he was coming up to going home for the weekend. And he was really nervous about it, as were most of them, because he had really hurt everybody in his family. And he was going home to begin the process of reconnecting with them. during the time that he sort of sunk into sort of the pit of where he was and decided to come into recovery, his mom had sent him an email every week, just once a week, keeping that connection going. So he was coming up to the weekend, and he was really nervous about it. So after the Tuesday after the weekend, we were checking in, asked him how it went. And he said, and I can still see this young man, and he had a big smile on his face, and he said, it was great. Oh, he said, Catherine, it was just great. He said, I got home, and he said, my mom wasn't upset with me. She wasn't angry. He said, I got home. She was really glad to see me. And he said, she had everything prepared at home. She even cleaned the carpets. And then while I was home, he said, I stayed in my old room, and my mom cooked all my favorite foods for me. And I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking, I've heard this story before. But I remember the prodigal son goes off and loses himself in a far country and wine, women, and song, and finally, blowing his inheritance, comes home thinking, begging his father, but his father runs out to greet him. And I said to Jeff, as he's telling the story, I said, Jeff, have you ever heard a story of something called the prodigal son? And he shook his head, no. And I said, well, I started to tell that story. I said, you see, that you are living that story right now. And one of the other fellows said, so ask him about the older brother, Catherine. So I said, well, Jeff, you said you had a sister. And how did she react to all this attention your mom was giving you? Oh, he said she was really glad, and she joined in and so forth. And then I continued and said, you see, told about the older brother and the prodigal son. I said, she's moved past all that and is able to be joyful for you in what you have found in your recovery. And it struck me then, in that moment, that here's the story of the prodigal son. Maybe today's youth or even adults, maybe they can't, you or I or others can't relate to somebody who demands their inheritance, goes off, blows it all, has to work as a farmhand, pigs going over a cliff, coming back to the father. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of an ancient story. But can we relate to a young man who gets involved with the wrong crowd, goes off, blows his life, comes home, is accepted, and there's a joyful reunion because he was lost. And now he's home and ready to make a new beginning. And so I think that you and I are living those stories every single day, and that we need to be telling them, writing them down, sharing them, telling them, and not just that, but looking for them, because they keep repeating over and over and over again. I'll tell you one more quick one, and this is a family story. I grew up in northern Quebec in a small town, and there was, when my parents were first there was not a church building. It was during the 50s, and as many of you will remember, the 50s was a time of sort of unprecedented church building, and so the congregation had been worshiping in, I think, the community at various different places over the years. Anyways, came time that they were going to put up a building. This is a bit before my time. But my mom tells this story many times. So my dad, being a good businessman, he was one of the people that didn't mind going out and asking people for money. There's not a lot of us that have that skill, but he was one of the few that he didn't mind sort of going and doing a sales pitch and saying, look, we need some money. So there was this one shopkeeper in town. He had a small grocery store, dépanier. And so we went to this man, and he said, explained, that he was canvassing, You're going to build a United Church in town, and would he, as one of the local businesses, support that? And the man said, well, no, I'm not interested in that. He said, why would I support that? He said, I'm Catholic. And so my dad's comeback was always, well, yes, you may be Catholic, but lots of Protestants, lots of United Church people shop in your store. So kept making this argument. Well, Mom said, my dad not being one to give up easily, he went back to this shopkeeper 5 times. And finally, after the 5th time, he came home and said to my mom, well, I got $5 out of him tonight. Now, in the 50s, $5 was, a half-decent donation. So 5 times he went to this man saying, we need money for this new church. And as a business person, I want you to help us support it. The woman that went to the unjust judge with her requests was blown off just like the man that owned this small grocery store. No, I'm not interested. Get away from me. I'm not going to deal with this. And she kept going back over and over again because the unjust judge didn't care a hoot about her or about what was right. This man that owned the Dépanier, the little grocery store, he wasn't interested in supporting this new venture. As he said, I'm Catholic. I don't want to support this. But my dad kept going back and convincing him that this would be a good thing to do. And so there we have it, the unjust judge and the woman that refused to take no for an answer. And so you see what I'm saying? We have these stories. And these are very relatable modern times. And I really think that as we're in this time of change, and I'm not going to use the word unprecedented or pivot or any of that stuff, because I'm so tired of it. But as we change and as the world changes, the stories don't change, but the way that we tell them has to change so that people can relate. So here's my challenge. So I always like to leave with a challenge. Here's my challenge. I want you to be aware this week and all through the summer of times and places where you see some of those gospel stories repeated or lived out. As I said to Jeff, you are living out the gospel. So keep your eyes and ears open this summer and see where those stories are being reincarnated, where they are being lived out right now. And please talk to me, because I'm compiling a book right now on modern-day gospel stories in the hopes that people will be able to connect in a new way and see how the more things change, the more they stay the same. And isn't that the truth? We have our faith, and it may work in different ways. We may express it in different ways throughout our life, but the whole concept of faith doesn't change. And that's really why we're here today, is because of that faith. So there's my challenge, and oh boy, we got a lot to do. So that's the end, and I hope you'll keep your eyes open for those gospel stories.